Imagine standing on the edge of a quiet California bay at dawn. The fog is thick, the water is still, and then, slowly, as the mist begins to pull back, you see them. 1, 2, 10, 20, 50. Over 100 massive steel warships, sitting silent and dark in the water, their hulls bleeding rust into the tide, their decks empty, their guns long removed, their flags gone. No crew, no engines running, no orders being given, just silence and steel and secrets. This is Sassoon Bay, and what you're looking at is one of the most extraordinary, most haunting, and most misunderstood military graveyards on the face of the earth. These are not abandoned boats. These are not forgotten toys. These are warships that carried American sailors through the most violent conflicts of the 20th century. These are vessels that crossed the Pacific under fire, that supplied troops on beaches soaked in blood, that kept the machinery of war running when everything else was falling apart. And now they sit here in a California delta, rotting slowly into the water, holding secrets that most Americans have never heard. Stay with me, because over the next hour, I'm going to take you deep into the story of the Sassoon Bay Reserve Fleet. I'm going to tell you who these ships are, where they came from, what they did, why they ended up here, and what they are doing to the bay around them. I'm going to tell you the stories of individual ships that will make your jaw drop. I'm going to tell you about the political battles, the environmental disasters, the ghost stories, and the moments of pure heartbreaking history that are literally dissolving into the mud of a California marsh. Because these ships deserve to be remembered, and you deserve to know the truth about what is sitting in that bay. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand Sassoon Bay, you have to understand what America was doing in the years after World War II ended. When the war finished in 1945, the United States had built the single most powerful naval and merchant fleet in the history of human civilization. Thousands of ships have been constructed at breakneck speed during the war years. Liberty ships, Victory ships, attack transports, landing craft carriers, tankers, ammunition ships, cargo vessels of every description. The American shipbuilding industry had performed a miracle that is almost impossible to comprehend even today. Before the war, the United States was building maybe a few dozen ships a year. By the peak of the war, American shipyards were launching a new vessel every single day. Every single day. These are not small boats. These were massive, ocean-going vessels capable of crossing entire oceans and delivering millions of tons of cargo to every theater of war on the planet. Without these ships, the Allied war effort would have collapsed. Without these ships, the troops on Normandy would not have had their ammunition. Without these ships, the Marines on Iwo Jima would not have had their food. Without these ships, the Pacific Campaign could never have happened. These ships won the war just as surely as any tank or fighter plane or infantryman. And when the war ended, the United States suddenly had more of them than it could possibly use. The question became, what do you do with all of this? You cannot just sink them. You cannot give them all away. You cannot sell them all on the open market without crashing the global shipping industry. And more importantly, you cannot be certain that you will not need them again. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was becoming a threat. Korea was unstable. The Middle East was complicated. The world was not at peace, not really. And the United States military understood that if another massive conflict erupted, you would need ships. Lots of ships. Fast. And building them from scratch takes years. So the decision was made to keep them, to put them in reserve, to anchor them in protected bays and inlets around the country, perform minimal maintenance, and keep them in a state where they could theoretically be brought back to life if they were ever needed. These collections of mothballed vessels became known as the National Defense Reserve Fleet, and Sassoon Bay, sitting in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta northeast of San Francisco, became one of the most important of these reserve locations. The bay was perfect. It was sheltered. It was deep enough. It was far enough from the open ocean that storms were not a major threat. And it was close enough to the major ports of San Francisco and Oakland that ships could be moved in and out with relative ease. So the ships came, slowly at first, and then in great numbers. They were towed into the bay, anchored in rows, stripped of their most sensitive equipment, and left to wait. Now here is something that most people do not appreciate about these ships. They were not dead, not officially, not for a long time. Many of them were maintained in what the military called a reduced operational status, which means that with enough work and enough time, they could be made ready for service again. And they were. During the Korean War, ships that had been sitting in Sassoon Bay and other reserve fleets around the country were pulled out, recommissioned, crewed, and sent back to sea. During the Vietnam War, the same thing happened again. When America needed to move massive quantities of supplies and equipment across the Pacific to support operations in Southeast Asia, the reserve fleet was activated. Ships that had been sitting in bays for years were suddenly alive again, crewed and running and crossing the ocean. This is the extraordinary thing about the ghost fleet of Sassoon Bay. It was never truly a graveyard. It was a waiting room, a sleeping army of steel ready to be woken up. And for decades, it served that purpose. The ships slept. The world changed. Crises came and went. And when they were needed, the ships were there. But time is relentless, and time does things to steel that nothing else can do. The hulls began to corrode. The decks began to weaken. The machinery, even in preserved condition, began to deteriorate beyond the point of practical return. And as the decades passed, the fleet in Sassoon Bay became less of a strategic reserve and more of a historical monument to a kind of American industrial and military power that no longer existed in the same form. The ships that sat in that bay were from a different era, an era when wars were won by tonnage, when victory depended on your ability to move millions of tons of material across thousands of miles of ocean. When a merchant marine was not a supporting role but a frontline force, a fleet of civilian mariners who sailed into war zones, under fire, delivering the supplies that kept the fighting machine alive. These were their ships, and they were dying. Let me tell you about some of them individually, because these vessels have names and histories that deserve to be spoken out loud. Let us start with the SS Red Oak Victory. This ship was built in 1944 at the Richmond shipyards in California, just a short distance from where it would eventually end up. The Victory ships were an improvement on the Liberty ships, faster and more capable, and the Red Oak Victory was one of 534 built between 1944 and 1946. During World War II, she carried ammunition to the Pacific Theater. Later, she served during the Korean War, and then again during the Vietnam War. 3 wars, 3 different eras of American conflict. When she finally arrived in Sassoon Bay, she carried with her the accumulated history of 30 years of American military operations. And here is what makes this ship different from most of the others that ended up in the bay. The Red Oak Victory was saved. A group of dedicated volunteers in Richmond fought for years to preserve her. And in 2000, she was towed to Richmond and turned into a museum ship. She is one of the very few vessels from the Sassoon Bay fleet that you can actually walk aboard today. And stepping on her decks is like stepping directly back into 1944. The hatches, the winches, the crew quarters, the engine room, all of it preserved as closely to its wartime condition as possible. She is extraordinary. She is a time machine made of steel. And the fact that she exists today is a testament to what is possible when people care enough to fight for history. But for every Red Oak victory, there are dozens of ships that were not so lucky. Take the story of the Glomar Challenger. Now this vessel has a complicated history that sits at the intersection of military secrecy, Cold War espionage, and deep-sea science in a way that seems almost too extraordinary to be true. The Glomar Challenger was built as a scientific research vessel in 1968, and she became famous for her role in the Deep-Sea Drilling Project, an international scientific program that used the ship to drill core samples from the ocean floor. The data she collected transformed our understanding of plate tectonics and the age of the Earth. She drilled in waters all over the globe and produced scientific results that are still being cited and studied today. But the ship has another, darker connection to the era of Sassoon Bay, because during the same period, a separate vessel called the Hughes Glomar Explorer was built under the cover of a deep-sea mining operation. But its real purpose was one of the most audacious intelligence operations in the history of the CIA. The Explorer was built to secretly recover a sunken Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The submarine, a Soviet Gulf-class vessel, had sunk in 1968 with all hands, and the CIA believed that its nuclear missiles and cryptographic equipment could provide invaluable intelligence. So they built an enormous ship, equipped it with a massive claw device designed to grab the submarine from 3 miles beneath the surface, and conducted the operation in complete secrecy. The cover story held for years, and by the time the press began reporting on the project, the operation had already been partially completed. The Cold War was fought in ways that most people still do not fully understand, and the vessels connected to that period that ended up in places like Sassoon Bay carry with them layers of classified history that are only now beginning to come to light. Let's talk about the Liberty ships, because no discussion of Sassoon Bay is complete without understanding what these vessels represented. The Liberty ship was the workhorse of the American war effort, a standardized cargo vessel designed to be built quickly, cheaply, and in enormous numbers. The original design could be constructed in a matter of weeks, with the record completion time being just 4.5 days from keel laying to launch. 4.5 days. Think about that. These were ocean-going vessels, hundreds of feet long, capable of carrying thousands of tons of cargo across entire oceans, and they were being built in days. The shipyards that produced them operated around the clock, 7 days a week. Women worked alongside men in the yards. African American workers found employment in the shipbuilding industry in numbers that would have been unthinkable before the war. The Liberty ships were not just a military achievement. They were a social achievement, a demonstration of what a fully mobilized American economy and American workforce could accomplish when the situation demanded it. Over 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war. 2,700. They carried the food and the fuel and the ammunition and the vehicles and the medicine and the raw materials that kept the Allied war effort alive. Without them, the war ends differently. Perhaps it ends with a negotiated peace. Perhaps it ends in disaster. Nobody knows. But what we know is that they worked. They crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific under constant threat of submarine attack. Hundreds of them were sunk. Thousands of American merchant mariners died aboard them. But thousands more voyages were completed, and the cargo reached its destination, and the armies were fed and armed and kept in the fight. And when the war ended, some of these ships came to Sassoon Bay. They arrived carrying the invisible weight of everything they had done, the cargoes they had carried, the ports they had visited, the sailors who had lived and sometimes died on their decks. And they sat there, year after year, decade after decade, growing older and quieter and more corroded, while the world moved on around them. There's a question that people always ask about Sassoon Bay, and it is a fair question. Why not just scrap them? Why let them sit there and rust? The answer is complicated, and it involves multiple layers of economics, politics, environmental regulation, and bureaucratic complexity that makes simple solutions almost impossible to implement. When a ship is scrapped, the process involves cutting the hull apart, recycling the steel, and disposing of any hazardous materials. And here's the problem. Ships of this era are absolutely packed with hazardous materials. Asbestos insulation was used extensively throughout these vessels, in the engine rooms, in the crew quarters, in the cargo holds. Polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs, were used in electrical systems throughout the fleet. Lead-based paints covered every interior and exterior surface. Heavy metals were used in dozens of different applications throughout the ships. Scrapping them is not simply a matter of cutting them up and melting them down. It is a complex hazardous materials operation that requires specialized facilities, trained workers, extensive environmental precautions, and enormous amounts of money. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the Maritime Administration, which is the federal agency responsible for the reserve fleet, began exploring options for disposing of the older vessels. And they ran into a wall of difficulty that took years to navigate. The first problem was that the hazardous materials made domestic scrapping extremely expensive. American environmental regulations, which are stringent and comprehensive, meant that the cost of properly scrapping a single ship could run into the millions of dollars. And with dozens or even hundreds of ships to dispose of, the total cost was staggering. So in the 1990s, the Maritime Administration began exploring the possibility of sending the ships overseas to be scrapped at facilities in countries with less stringent environmental regulations. They struck deals with yards in India and Bangladesh and other countries where the ships could be broken down more cheaply. And this is where the story gets genuinely disturbing. Because the conditions at these foreign scrapping yards, particularly those in South Asia, were nightmarish. Workers, often including children, worked without proper protective equipment, handling asbestos and PCBs and other toxic materials with their bare hands. The beaches where the ships were run aground for scrapping were contaminated with heavy metals and toxic chemicals. Workers died of asbestos-related diseases. The environmental damage was severe and ongoing. American warships, vessels that had served the United States military with distinction, were ending their lives in conditions that amounted to an environmental and humanitarian disaster. When journalists and environmental groups began documenting what was happening, the public reaction was fierce. Lawsuits were filed. Environmental groups obtained court orders blocking further exports. The Maritime Administration was forced to reconsider its approach, and this led to a period of genuine confusion and inaction, during which the ships continued to sit in Sassoon Bay, continuing to deteriorate, continuing to leak contaminants into the bay, while the bureaucratic and legal battles over what to do with them dragged on for years. It was a genuine policy failure, a situation where no good options existed, where every path forward involved costs and complications and political battles, and where the easiest thing to do was simply nothing. And nothing is what was done for a long time. The environmental consequences of that inaction were serious. The hulls of these ships, as they corroded, were leaking materials into Sassoon Bay. Tributyl-tin, a toxic anti-fouling paint compound, was found in the sediment around the fleet. PCBs were detected in the water. Heavy metals were accumulating in the bay floor. Marine biologists began documenting impacts on the local ecosystem. Fish populations in the area showed signs of contamination. And Sassoon Bay is not an isolated body of water. It is part of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, one of the most ecologically important waterway systems in California, providing habitat for endangered species, supplying water to millions of Californians, and supporting a complex and fragile ecosystem that took millions of years to develop. The idea that this ecosystem was being contaminated by the slow dissolution of a fleet of World War II-era warships was not acceptable. Not to the environmental groups, not to the state of California, and eventually not to the federal government. The pressure built over years. Environmental lawsuits accumulated. Congressional hearings were held. Investigative journalists produced report after report documenting the conditions in the bay and the political obstacles preventing cleanup. And slowly, things began to change. The Maritime Administration began contracting with domestic shipyards for scrapping operations. The Navy developed new procedures for handling hazardous materials. Funding was appropriated, argued over, cut, restored, and eventually deployed. And ships began to leave Sassoon Bay. Not quickly, not efficiently, but steadily. One by one, or sometimes two by two, the old vessels were towed away to be broken down. At the peak of the reserve fleet in the early 1990s, there were over 100 ships anchored in Sassoon Bay. By the 2000s, that number had dropped significantly. By the 2010s, it had dropped further. And while there are still vessels in the bay today, the fleet is a shadow of what it once was. But the ships that remain are perhaps the most historically significant of all, because the ones that have survived this long have survived for reasons that go beyond simple neglect. Some of them are under active consideration for preservation as museum ships. Some are entangled in legal disputes over ownership and liability. Some are kept in reserve because the military genuinely believes they might still be useful. And some are simply so large, so complex, and so contaminated that figuring out what to do with them is a problem that has defeated multiple generations of government officials. Let us talk about the human beings who sailed these ships, because that is the story that often gets lost when people talk about the fleet in abstract terms of policy and environment and history. The merchant mariners who crewed these vessels were not military in the traditional sense. They were civilians. They did not receive veterans' benefits. They were not eligible for the GI Bill. They did not march in parades or receive medals in the same way that military veterans did. But they sailed into the same war zones. They faced the same submarines. They watched their shipmates die. And they delivered the cargo that made everything else possible. During World War II, the United States Merchant Marine suffered a higher rate of casualties as a percentage of those serving than any branch of the American military. The submarines of Germany's U-boat fleet treated merchant vessels as primary targets. Hundreds of ships were sunk in the Atlantic alone. The men who went down with those ships and the men who survived the sinkings and were rescued and went back to sea demonstrated a kind of courage that deserves far more recognition than it has ever received. It was not until 1988, more than 40 years after the war ended, that Congress finally granted merchant mariners who served during World War II the status of veterans, making them eligible for some of the benefits that their military counterparts had received decades earlier. 40 years. For men who had risked their lives on the most dangerous shipping lanes in the history of naval warfare. The stories of these men are embedded in the steel of the ships in Sassoon Bay. When you look at those rusting hulls, you're looking at the workplace of men who got up every morning knowing that a torpedo could end their lives before nightfall. Men who wrote letters home that sometimes never arrived because they went down with the ship. Men who saw friends and colleagues disappear beneath the Atlantic waves and then, because there was no other choice, signed on for another voyage. Their names are not famous. Their faces are not on postage stamps. But their service made possible every other aspect of the American victory in World War II. And the ships that carried them deserve to be honored as monuments to that service. Now let us spend some time talking about the specific ships that have the most interesting and in some cases most classified histories. Because Sassoon Bay was not just home to ordinary cargo vessels. Over the years, it has housed vessels with connections to some of the most sensitive and extraordinary chapters of American military history. The Reserve Fleet was, in a sense, a repository not just of ships, but of secrets. Because a ship that is mothballed and placed in reserve has its logs sealed and its records classified, and the full story of where it went and what it carried may not become publicly available for decades. Consider the vessels that served during Operation Earnest, in the late 1980s, the American military operation to escort Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War. Or the ships that were involved in the massive logistical operations of Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991, when the United States had to rapidly deploy an army of over 500,000 troops and millions of tons of equipment to the Middle East. Some of the vessels that supported those operations ended up in Sassoon Bay after their service was complete. They look like ordinary cargo ships, but their logbooks, if you could read them, would tell stories of convoys through mine-filled waters, of deliveries to ports that were within range of enemy missiles, of sailors who kept the supply chain running when the entire world was watching to see whether American military power could still project itself effectively across the globe. The 1991 Gulf War was, among other things, a demonstration of what the Reserve Fleet could still do. When the crisis began, the Maritime Administration activated vessels from the reserve fleets around the country. Ships that had been sitting in Sassoon Bay and other locations for years were inspected, made ready, crewed, and dispatched. They carried the tanks and the helicopters and the ammunition and the fuel that made Desert Storm possible. Without those ships, the American military buildup in Saudi Arabia would have taken far longer and been far more difficult. The Reserve Fleet proved its value one more time. And then, when the war was over, the ships came back. Some of them returned to Sassoon Bay, older and more tired than before, but having added another chapter to their already extraordinary histories. There's also the matter of the hospital ships. During and after World War II, a number of vessels were converted from cargo carriers to hospital ships, painted white with red crosses, and deployed to carry the wounded from the battlefield back to medical facilities. These were vessels of mercy sailing in the middle of war, theoretically protected by international law, but in practice always at risk. Some of these ships ended up in reserve after their service was completed, and the thought of a hospital ship sitting quietly in a California bay, its white paint long faded to gray, its red crosses covered by rust, is one of the most poignant images that the Sassoon Bay Fleet conjures. These were the ships that brought men home who might not otherwise have made it. The surgeons who worked in their operating rooms. The nurses who sat with dying men through the night. The decks that were stained with blood and then scrubbed clean and then stained again. All of that history sitting quietly in the water. I want to talk about something that most people who cover the Sassoon Bay Fleet never mention, and that is the psychological dimension of these ships. The ways in which they have captured the imagination of artists and writers and filmmakers and urban explorers. Because there is something about a fleet of rusting warships sitting in silent rows that speaks to something deep in the human consciousness. They are massive. They are obviously man-made. They were built for a specific and violent purpose. And now they are still. The contrast between what they were and what they are is jarring in a way that simple photographs do not fully capture. You have to see them in person from the water to understand the scale of them. These are not small boats. They are ships that dwarf anything you're likely to encounter in everyday life. Their hulls rise 30, 40, 50 feet above the waterline. Their superstructures tower above that, and they stretch in rows that seem to go on forever, ship after ship after ship, until the fog swallows them and they disappear into the gray water and the gray sky. Photographers have been drawn to the fleet for decades. The images they produce are extraordinary. Rust patterns of remarkable complexity and color, orange and red and brown and black, overlaid on the dark gray of the original hull paint. Portholes that once looked out on the North Atlantic or the South Pacific, now dark and empty. Davits where lifeboats once hung, now holding nothing. Anchors and chains thick with corrosion. The occasional bird nesting in a sheltered spot on a superstructure. And the water around the ships, dark and still and somehow slightly sinister, as if the bay itself knows what is sitting in it. These images have appeared in books and magazines and galleries around the world. They have been used to illustrate stories about American decline, about the cost of war, about the passage of time, about the relationship between human ambition and natural entropy. They are beautiful and they are terrible in the true sense of that word, inspiring a kind of awe that is not entirely comfortable. Writers have been drawn to the fleet as well. The ghost ships of Sassoon Bay have appeared in fiction, in poetry, in journalism, in academic writing. They have been used as settings for thrillers and mysteries. They have been the subjects of environmental investigations and historical analyses. They have inspired essays about memory and forgetting, about the ways in which a society chooses to honor or dishonor its history. Because there is an argument to be made that leaving these ships to rust in a bay, slowly contaminating the water around them, is not just an environmental failure, but a moral one. These ships served. They did what was asked of them. And the way they are being allowed to end, not in honor, but in slow dissolution, says something about how we treat the physical artifacts of our history when they are no longer convenient. At the same time, there is another argument that the fleet in its current state of beautiful decay is itself a kind of monument. That the rust and the silence and the emptiness are more honest about the reality of war than any polished museum exhibit could be. That there is something true about the sight of these massive instruments of national power sitting forgotten in a California bay, slowly returning to the elements from which they were made. That the ghost fleet of Sassoon Bay is a memento mori for the age of industrial warfare. A reminder that the machinery of conflict, no matter how impressive or powerful it seems in its moment, is ultimately temporary. That war's end, that Navy's age, that steel corrodes, that everything built by human hands eventually becomes something else. Let me now take you through the process of what happens when one of these ships is finally removed from the bay. Because the logistics are extraordinary, and the challenge of moving a vessel that may have been sitting in the same spot for 30 or 40 years without its engines running is formidable. The first step is a comprehensive assessment. A team of engineers and environmental specialists goes aboard the vessel and evaluates its condition. They check the hull for structural integrity, because a ship that has been sitting for decades may have areas of the hull so corroded that moving her creates a risk of catastrophic flooding. They test for asbestos and PCBs and other hazardous materials. They evaluate the condition of the machinery and the fuel systems, because old fuel left in tanks for decades becomes sludge, and sludge presents its own set of environmental and handling challenges. They map every potential problem and develop a plan for addressing each one. Then comes the preparation. Workers go aboard and begin the process of making the ship safe for towing. Temporary pumps are installed to manage any flooding during transit. Hazardous materials that are loose or at risk of spilling during the tow are secured or removed. The hull is inspected by divers who check the outside of the vessel for any obvious structural problems. Tow lines are attached, and then, slowly, enormously, the ship begins to move for the first time in years. The anchor chains that have held her in place are raised. The tugs take up the strain on the tow lines. And the ship, this massive accumulation of history and steel, begins to move. Slowly at first, then, impossibly slowly, she clears the other ships in the anchorage and makes her way toward the channel and the open water beyond. It is a sight that those who have witnessed it describe as profoundly moving, because you are watching something that seemed permanent begin to change, something that seemed dead begin to move, and you are aware, watching it, that whatever is about to happen to that ship, whether it is to be scrapped or preserved or converted or sunk as an artificial reef, this is the last time she will ever float in those waters. Some of the ships that have left Sassoon Bay have met extraordinary ends. A number of them have been sunk as artificial reefs, creating new marine habitats that over the years become encrusted with coral and sponges and seagrasses, becoming home to hundreds of species of fish and other marine creatures. The transformation of a warship into an artificial reef is one of the more elegant solutions to the disposal problem. Instead of spending millions of dollars to cut the ship apart and haul the pieces away, you clean it of hazardous materials, prepare it carefully, take it out to an appropriate location, and sink it. Within a few years, it becomes a thriving ecosystem. Divers love them, the fish love them, and the ship, which carried weapons and supplies for war, ends its existence by sustaining life. There is something genuinely poetic about that. Other ships have been preserved as museum vessels. We have talked about the Red Oak Victory, but there are others as well. Museum ships scattered around the country that were once part of the reserve fleet or vessels similar to those in the fleet, now serving as floating monuments to the era of steam-powered cargo ships and the men who sailed them. The challenge with museum ships is always money. It costs an enormous amount to maintain a steel vessel in a condition that is both safe for visitors and historically accurate. The organizations that run these museums are typically nonprofits working on tight budgets, and the ongoing cost of rust prevention and structural maintenance alone can be staggering. Many museum ships are in a constant state of financial crisis, perpetually raising money to keep the hulls from deteriorating while also providing educational programs and maintaining historical collections. It is a labor of love, and the people who do it are among the most dedicated and underappreciated preservationists in America. And some ships have simply been scrapped, cut apart by workers in American shipyards, their steel melted down and recycled, their histories ending in a cascade of sparks and cutting torches and the crash of falling steel. There is a certain pragmatism to this end, and it would be wrong to suggest that scrapping is inherently dishonorable. The steel of these ships becomes new steel. It enters the American industrial economy and gets made into buildings and bridges and new vehicles and perhaps Someday, new ships. The material continues, even as the particular form it took ends. But the scrapping of a historic vessel is also an irreversible act. Once the ship is cut apart, it cannot be reassembled. The specific object, with its specific history and its specific accumulation of human experience, is gone forever. And that is always a loss, even when it is a necessary one. Now I want to talk about something that does not get enough attention in the story of Sassoon Bay, and that is the role of the civilian workers who have maintained this fleet over the decades. Because the ships do not just sit there without anyone touching them. There has always been a small crew of workers employed by the Maritime Administration and its contractors who go out to the fleet regularly to perform inspections, to pump out bilges, to operate fire suppression systems, to check for structural problems, and to do the 1,000 small tasks that are necessary to keep a mothballed fleet from descending into complete ruin. These men and women have spent careers working on ships that most Americans do not know exist. They have developed intimate knowledge of individual vessels, knowing the particular quirks of their bilge pumps and the specific weaknesses in their hull plating and the ways that their superstructures shift and settle over the decades. They are the unsung keepers of the Ghost Fleet, and their expertise is a form of living history that disappears with each retirement. When a worker who has spent 30 years maintaining the ships in Sassoon Bay retires, the institutional knowledge they carry retires with them. And no amount of documentation fully replaces the kind of knowledge that comes from decades of hands-on experience with specific vessels. There's also the community of Benicia, the small city on the shore of Sassoon Bay that has lived alongside the fleet for decades. The fleet has been a part of the Benicia landscape for so long that local residents have developed complicated feelings about it. Some see it as an eyesore, a collection of rusting hulks that sits between the city and the bay and contributes nothing to the local economy. Others see it as a historic and even beautiful presence, a physical connection to a past that is disappearing. There have been debates in Benicia about the fleet that mirror the larger national debates about how to treat the physical remains of military history. And the city has had to deal with the environmental consequences of having a leaking fleet of old ships on its doorstep. Consequences that have affected property values and tourism and the quality of life of residents who live near the shore. The story of Sassoon Bay cannot be told without talking about the activists and environmentalists who have fought for decades to accelerate the cleanup of the fleet. These are people who saw what was happening to the bay and decided that they could not simply accept it. They filed lawsuits and organized campaigns and testified at congressional hearings and wrote reports and generated media coverage and generally made themselves as difficult as possible for the federal agencies that they believed were moving too slowly. Some of them have spent literally decades on this fight. And while the pace of cleanup has never satisfied them, the fact that the cleanup is happening at all, that ships are being removed and disposed of, and that the fleet is dramatically smaller than it was 20 years ago, is in large part a result of their persistence. This is what environmental advocacy looks like in practice. Not a single dramatic victory, but a long, grinding campaign of pressure and legal action and public education that eventually moves the needle incrementally, but undeniably. Let me tell you about the night anchorage. This is something that very few people know about. In the early years of the reserve fleet, when there were hundreds of ships anchored in Sassoon Bay, there was a small fleet of caretaker vessels that moved among them at night. These were small boats, crewed by a handful of workers, that would make rounds through the anchored fleet after dark, checking for problems, listening for the sounds that indicate a ship taking on water, watching for fires or other emergencies. The men who did this work described it as an otherworldly experience. Moving in small boats through rows of massive, dark, silent ships in the middle of the night. The only sounds being the lap of water against steel hulls and the creaking of anchor chains. The ships towering above them on both sides, their portholes dark, their decks empty. It was, by all accounts, both eerie and magnificent, and in a way, it captures something essential about the fleet. These men, moving in their small boats, were the last human connection to ships that had once been home to hundreds of sailors. They were the keepers of the silence, the guardians of the ghost fleet in the most literal possible sense. As we move toward the end of our time together, I want to talk about what the future holds for the remaining ships in Sassoon Bay. And I want to be honest with you. The future is complicated. There are still vessels in the bay, fewer than there once were, but still present, still presenting the same mix of historical significance and environmental challenge that has defined the fleet for decades. Some of these remaining ships are being actively evaluated for disposal. Others are being considered for preservation. A few are tied up in ongoing legal and administrative processes that could take years to resolve. The Maritime Administration continues to work on cleanup and disposal, but the pace is slow and the funding is never quite adequate to the scale of the problem. There are advocacy groups working to ensure that the most historically significant vessels are preserved. There are environmental groups working to ensure that the cleanup proceeds as quickly and thoroughly as possible. There are historians and archivists working to document the histories of individual ships before those histories are lost forever. And there are the ships themselves, sitting in the bay, weathering the tides and the fog and the passing years, bearing witness to a chapter of American history that most of the people who live near them do not fully understand. What would it mean to truly honor these ships? I think it would mean several things. It would mean accelerating the environmental cleanup of the bay, removing the contamination that decades of rust and leaking hulls have deposited in the sediment and the water. It would mean preserving the most historically significant vessels in conditions that allow people to learn from them and connect with the history they represent. It would mean telling the stories of the men and women who built these ships and sailed them and maintained them and fought for them. It would mean treating the National Defense Reserve Fleet not as an embarrassment or a bureaucratic problem to be managed, but as what it actually is, a physical archive of the most consequential period in American military and industrial history. Because these ships are not just steel, they are memory. They are the physical embodiment of decisions and sacrifices and achievements that shaped the world we live in today. The world that emerged from World War II, with its institutions and its alliances and its patterns of international trade and military deployment, was made possible in part by ships like the ones that sit in Sassoon Bay. When you look at those rusting hulls, you're looking at the infrastructure of a particular moment in history, a moment when American industrial capacity and American political will and American human effort combined to produce an outcome that changed everything. That deserves to be remembered. That deserves to be honored. And the ships of Sassoon Bay, if we choose to treat them with the seriousness they deserve, can be teachers of extraordinary power. Not just for military historians or naval enthusiasts, but for anyone who wants to understand how the modern world came to be. The fog rolls in over Sassoon Bay, as it always does, in the early morning and the late afternoon, covering the water and the ships in a gray silence that feels ancient. In that fog, the ships become shapes rather than objects, presences rather than things. And in that state, stripped of the specific details of rivets and portholes and rust patterns, they become something elemental. a monument to the human capacity for violence and also for sacrifice, for destruction and also for creation, for war and also, eventually, for something better than war. They are all of these things simultaneously, and they are worth knowing. They are worth caring about. They are worth the hour you have just spent with them. So before you go, I have a question for you. If you could save one ship from the ghost fleet of Sassoon Bay, restore it completely, and turn it into a museum that told the full story of the National Defense Reserve Fleet and the men and women who built and sailed these vessels, where would you put it? What story would you want it to tell? And who do you think deserves to be honored in the telling of that story? Think about that. And if you have thoughts, if you have connections to this history, if you have family members who served in the Merchant Marine or worked in the wartime shipyards or sailed on any of these vessels, please share their stories in the comments below. Because every story matters. Every name deserves to be spoken. And together, we can make sure that the ghost fleet of Sassoon Bay is never truly forgotten. If this video moved you, if it taught you something you did not know, if it made you think differently about the rusting ships sitting in that California bay, please share it. Share it with someone who loves history. Share it with someone who served. Share it with someone who has never heard of Sassoon Bay and whose understanding of American military history will be richer for knowing that it exists. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are thousands of stories like this one sitting in bays and battlefields and archives and memories waiting to be told. And we're going to tell them.